Hello everybody, today we're going to be teaching you one of the most essential parts of Java, or any programming language for that matter, and that is loops. Now you might be asking yourself, what are loops and how can they help me? Well, loops are essential. They're very important for almost any program. So let's start with the most basic kind of loop, shall we? Now the most basic one is the while loop. Now Jerry, what is a while loop?
A while loop is a kind of loop that keeps looping until a certain condition that you set is met, after which it exits the loop.
Correct. Now, we're going to make a demonstration of the while loop right now. Let's say you want to print the numbers 1 to 10, for example. Now, what do we do at this point?
You would declare, for example, an integer and set it to, let's say, 0.
Okay, 0.
Then you would type while in brackets, the condition, and in this condition, for this case, our condition would be while x is less than or equal to 10.
Now we want to write x is less than or equal to 10 is so that we can have it display 10. If it's only less than 10, 10 will not be displayed because as soon as it hits it, it'll end. But if we write equals, it won't end.
Yep.
Now, what do we do next? Well, obviously, we can do system.out.println, and we want to print the x. Now, how do we make the x go up? Well, that's simple. Just add the x, and voila. And what should happen is it will create a program that runs from 0 all the way to 10, and that is the while loop. However, there's not only the while loop that exists. There are many different types of loops. Another very important loop is called the for loop. What is a for loop, Jerry?
A for loop is also another kind of loop, but it's mostly used when you know exactly how many times you want the loop to run. For example, if we want to print a 0 to 10 again, we know that it will print exactly 11 times the numbers from 0 to 10. So for the syntax of a for loop, you would type for in brackets. Then there's 3 parts to the for loop statement. First would be the first part is where you declare a variable and set it to something. For example, int num is equal to 0.
All right, num is 0. Now the next part is you want to make a condition. You want to make it run a certain number of times. To have a condition where it will just run until it meets it. This part is similar to a while loop. Now in this case, let's say you want to count to 10. So while the num is less than or equal to 10. Now the third part is to make sure the continuation. You want to make num go up one every single time. Well, in this case at least. Now using this format, this program will run 10 times. Now, what do you want to do with this program?
So let's just make it do the same thing in the while loop did. So let's just print out the number. And we don't have to increment it by saying a num plus plus because we already did that in the for loop statement.
So if you know how many times you want to run it, for loops are always a better option. And we say yes. And it does exactly the same thing.
There's also a third kind of loop called the do while loop.
Now the do while loop is not as commonly used, but it's still very good. Now, Jerry, would you like to explain this?
A do while loop is essentially the same as a while loop, except that it will always run through the program once, even if the condition you set is not initially true. So you would do, and then you would write your code in there.
Now, let's say we want to count from 0 to 10 again.
Well, you would set the, for example, int num equals to 0 outside of the do while loop. Then in the do while loop, you would do system.out.println num plus plus.
All right, num plus plus.
And after the entire do structure, you would type while in brackets. Num is greater than 0 and num is less than or equal to 10. Just as an example.
Num is less than or equal to 10. All right.
So normally, if you were to run this as a normal while loop, it would not run through even once, since num is not greater than 0 initially.
It is 0.
But it is 0. But since it's a do while loop, it will run through once. It will at least. It will encounter the num plus plus statement, in which case it would become 1 and continue running until num is not less than or equal to 10 anymore. So this loop would also print out 0 to 10. So let's just run that.
Let's run that. Does exactly the same thing. Now, there might not be much of a difference. It's just literally, for do while, you just want to have it run at least once. That is the major difference and the key difference between this type of loop and the while loop.
And that is the basics of loops. Thank you for listening.
You're welcome.